Tonight on Talking Politics, after a year and a half of negotiations, the city of Boston and the union representing its police officers have agreed to a new 5-year contract. I'll be joined by the union's president, Larry Calderone, and former Bay State Banner senior editor Yawu Miller to go over the agreement, the reforms that were included, and the reforms that were left out. But first, young voters are feeling deeply distrustful right now of President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump on several key issues. That is according to a new poll by the Institute of Politics at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, which predicts a sharp decline in youth voter turnout in 2024 compared to the record-setting turnout of 2020. For a deep dive into who feels left behind and why, I'm joined by John Della Volpe, Director of Polling at the Institute of Politics, and by Ethan Jasny. He's a Harvard student and chair of the university's Public Opinion Project. Thank you both for being here. John, youth voter turnout was huge for President Biden in 2020, as I just mentioned. The picture looks very different heading into 2024. How much have things changed, or how much do things seem poised to change?
Well, things are certainly in a state of flux, I would argue right now. But to take one step back, I think that we don't have a President Biden today, if not for the increasing levels of participation in 2020 and their overwhelming support, 60% plus in most states, for President Biden back in 2020. We think about the 5 battleground states, Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and in each of those states, President Trump won the vote of people over the age of 45. It is this youth vote, this highly energized youth vote, which was a core building block of that constituency. It's critical.
Really glad that you pulled back to offer that perspective. Yeah. And you worked with the Biden campaign to get out that vote.
I did. Correct? I took a leave of absence from the IOP back in those days to work on that. Yeah.
Okay, so the big number that jumped out at me is that at this point in the last election cycle, 57% of people ages 18 through 29 said they were likely to vote in the upcoming election. It's down to 49%.
Correct.
In your latest poll. Do you have a sense of why that is?
I think a couple things. One is the people who self-identify as Democrats are more or less on the same page in terms of likelihood of voting. But we've seen sharp decreases both among Republicans, double digits, as well as an increasing number of people who are choosing to identify as independents. And that's the group, specifically the college students within that group, African American young men and women, as well as Hispanic and Latino young men and women, are all just kind of feeling disenfranchised, I think, at this point, relative to, again, where we were 4 years ago.
Ethan, I want to ask you about the groups that John just mentioned. I think it's actually we have a chart. We should pull it up just to give viewers a sense of all the different groups out there that are apparently less likely to vote. You look at black voters, it's about a 12% drop in people saying they're likely to vote. For Hispanic voters, a 16% drop. And I was struck by both of those, but I was also struck by the drop in women saying that they are likely to vote, especially post-Dobbs and after the overturning of Roe v. Wade. They dropped by about 9 points. I'd like to get your sense of why those groups in particular may be not as excited about voting as they were 4 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not just likelihood to vote. We've seen over the past couple of years, actually, the proportion of Hispanics and black young Americans identifying as Democrats decrease. And they're not becoming Republicans, they're becoming independents. And that's why you see as well, there's not that big of a decline in Democrats that are likely to vote, but there are also just fewer people identifying as Democrats, right? And so that decline in independence is super important as well. To your question about why there's sort of this disengagement among young black and Hispanic individuals, I think, it can be a combination of factors, not seeing themselves represented in the government in various ways. I think if you look at young black and Hispanic individuals as well, they feel like they're in worse personal financial situations. It seems like the economy potentially is having, more adverse effects on them. And so that could be a reason as well why they're less likely to be engaging and to saying they're going to vote.
Do you have any thoughts? And I'm happy to get you chiming in here too if you do, but what about the drop in women's interest in voting? That, I think, of all the findings in your poll, is probably the one that surprised me the most. You want to take a crack at it first, or do you? Either one's fine.
Yeah, I can start off. I mean, I think, that is surprising. I think the good news there, though, is that abortion is clearly a really important issue going forward and something to engage, I think, young women in particular. We found findings that 2 in 3 young Americans as a whole say that abortion is an important issue when choosing where people want to, which state to live in. So putting aside even the ballot, like this is an issue that's affecting people's lives, particularly young women. And even if you look at people who currently say that they're not sure they're going to vote in 2024, they do say that if there's an abortion referendum on the ballot, around 22% said that they would definitely vote in that. So I think that is potentially concerning. If you're Biden and Democrats right now, but abortion, reproductive rights is certainly a way of sort of addressing that, I think.
John, you have anything to add?
When we do focus groups, and we do dozens of them over the course of the year, it's common, actually, it's common that a young person, a young woman, specifically a young woman of color, will say, you know what, I've been doing my job. You told me to vote, I voted in 2018. You told me to vote, I voted in 2022. You know what? And I sit back, and it seems like the more I vote, the fewer rights I have. Rights are being taken away despite the fact that I'm participating. So, Adam, what we're really focused on is helping young people see that their vote mattered in 2020. It's a very different place and very different country because of them. We don't have the first African-American female on the Supreme Court. There is a better representation than I think they appreciate, and a lot of those accomplishments. The younger people are choosing not to pay as close attention to the news and are in many cases missing kind of the progress that's being made, which is depressing levels of participation. You
mentioned the focus groups that you do in addition to the polling. I was listening to a New York Times piece that you did talking about your findings. One of the focus groups you mentioned, and I found this fascinating, that the young voters you talked to do not think that the president and the former president, politicians generally, don't understand their problems. They think they understand them, but just aren't acting to ameliorate them, right?
That's right. And those independents who are less likely to vote, they think that they don't see a significant difference between the two parties. At the end of the day, they will tell you that both parties are run by elites, and they're choosing to focus on servicing the elites rather than the working class and the people who are more vulnerable members of the society, specifically younger people.
Ethan, people are not keen on President Biden, right? He's got 35% approval in this poll, something that in a way calls to mind other polls that we've seen where he's really struggling with approval numbers. You found that young voters conceptualize their support for President Biden, if they support him, differently than Trump voters think through their support for him. Can you break down the difference there?
Exactly, yeah. So a large majority of people who say they're going to vote for Biden say they're doing so to prevent former President Trump from becoming president again, whereas it's the flip side for Trump, where a large majority of Trump voters say they're doing so out of loyalty to the president's policies and values. And so, I think that does point to the fact that potentially there's not all that much, natural enthusiasm for the president. At the same time, though, negative partisanship is a powerful force. And so when you look at the head-to-head, particularly among likely voters, Biden versus Trump, Biden is hitting the margins of where he was at in 2020. And I think in the 2020 race as well, a lot of that was about opposition to Trump, right? And opposition to all that was. So I think an important part of, Biden's role going forward is certainly to emphasize the qualities of his administration, all that he's done and accomplished over the last 3-4 years, but also to point out and to remind young people what life was like between 2016 and 2020 under the Trump administration. Because I think, as the poll shows, that's clearly a powerful motivating factor as well.
John took a step back earlier. I'm hoping you can take a step back as well, in part because you're a member of the cohort that we're talking about here. When it comes to the beliefs of young voters, Generation Z voters, is it possible to make generalizations that cut across party lines? Whatever their choice for president, however they feel about this particular issue, they are united on X, Y, and Z?
I think what we can say is that over the past 10 years, our generation, or young people 18 to 29, has gotten gradually more progressive on a variety of very basic issues. We sort of did a deep dive on this in our poll in the spring. But when you look at issues like, do you think that the government should do more to address poverty, should do more to address climate change, should provide more welfare? Those types of questions have increased, support in double digits over the past 10, 15 years, even while at the same time we don't see the proportion who identify as Democrats or Republicans changing much. If anything, the proportion who identify as Democrats has decreased over the past 5 years.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, so I mean, I was just going to say, I think in general there is a movement, underneath that party ID for more supportive, more progressive, interventionist policy.
Along those lines, there were a couple other traits that jumped out at me. Tell me if I am getting this right. Growing support for abortion just across the board among younger voters. A plurality of people 18 to 29 identifying as independents. Support for labor unions with the possible exception of police unions and for Republicans, Starbucks unions, which I was fascinated by. This group is not excited about artificial intelligence. I think about a third believe that it's going to worsen their job prospects moving forward. And then there's the distrust piece, which we alluded to at the start of this segment. I want to pull up a poll quote that you provided in your write-up of the poll that highlights just how much people don't trust the current president, the former president. The line in question, a plurality trusts neither Biden nor Trump on important issues like the Israel-Hamas war, Ukraine, climate change, gun violence, healthcare, crime, and public safety. John, is that level of distrust ordinary?
It's a problem. It's a problem. Sadly, it is all too ordinary, Adam. As we see this just increasing lack of trust in major institutions, right?
So if just to be clear, if you've done, or the Institute's done, I think 46 of these polls.
Right.
10 years ago, would we have seen similar distrust with the two front runners, or 20 years ago, for example?
Well, listen, I think in 2020 we saw less distrust in 2020, specifically on the economy, that Biden had a significant advantage at that point. But what we have seen, we have seen this kind of increasing lack of trust in institutions, I think sped up by the debate around COVID and vaccines, et cetera. We know that's kind of already in the air. But I think what those numbers tell us is that a significant portion of young Americans, again, are stepping back. They have not been paying close attention to the positive accomplishments of the administration. And it's for the White House to actually find a way to kind of square that up, to communicate that it's a different country. There's more access to health care. There's the first significant gun violence prevention legislation in 2 generations. That there is an effort to bring peace to Israel and the Hamas situation, et cetera. So that is what I think what we're seeing. We're seeing, because of young people, surge of concern around their mental health crisis. They're choosing not to spend time on things that stress them out. Politics, the news stresses them out, so they're not seeing a lot of these accomplishments. And I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing this lack of trust.
Is it fair to say that another thing that the administration could be doing is focusing on abortion? You talked about how valuable that is as a motivating force. We talked about how across this age cohort, an increasing number of people think it should just be available as a matter of course. But President Biden is notoriously uncomfortable talking about it, given his own personal take on the issue. Is that something that it would behoove the president to do moving forward, do you think, Ethan?
Yeah, I mean, I think our results show that abortion is really key, not just something to talk about, but also to, put on ballots, right? That's what we found, where there's broad, a lot of people saying that they would be likely to vote in an abortion referendum, even people who wouldn't vote in 2024 otherwise. So getting those types of things on the ballot, I think, is another important strategy, and doing what you can at the state level. It's not just, what the administration does, but I do think in general that abortion is a really key issue, especially for those young women.
Is that something that you think President Biden would benefit from doing?
Without question. In fact, earlier this week I read there's interest in putting that ballot measure in Montana. Right, which was increasing youth participation would certainly help Senator Tester's reelection as well.
All right, John Della Volpe, Ethan Jasny, thank you both for breaking this down. It's fascinating stuff that you came up with.
Thanks for having us.
Next up, the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association has ratified a new 5-year contract with the city totaling $82.3 million. The deal comes with retroactive pay bumps for the city's officers, as well as some key reforms that Mayor Michelle Wu has been pushing for since she was a candidate for mayor. Well, both Wu and the union are touting this as a win-win. There are some critics who've suggested the reforms may not go far enough. So what exactly is in the agreement and what was left on the cutting room floor? Joining me to discuss is the union's president, Larry Calderon, and Yawu Miller, the former senior editor of the Bay State Banner. Thank you both for being here. Larry, the mayor made a point of highlighting in the press release that the city put out about this, that this contract was reached through negotiation rather than arbitration. Can you explain why that is significant to people who might not be familiar with how this stuff usually shakes out?
Sure, I'd be delighted to. Thank you for having me on, too, and at least getting an inside view, if you will, about,
thanks for being here,
about how the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association now conducts itself and the members we represent. So I want to say thank you for having me on. Sure. So the arbitration process is run through a statewide committee called the Joint Labor Management Committee, who assist both municipalities when they're negotiating contracts that are basically stalled between municipal, fire, and police departments. It's a long, tedious process. It's fair to both sides of the table, but it does take time. So it was very important to sit down with the mayor and her team and get something that we could bring back to the men and women that I represent and have them vote to ratify it. It's a faster process. Typically, both sides make out better when you have a negotiated contract than you do at the Joint Labor Management Committee, because you have an independent arbitrator that you go in and you present your testimony and your reasons why. Of course, we're there advocating for the people we represent, and the city is doing the same on their side. And it tends to, more often than not be satisfactory to both sides. Each side gets a little bit of what they want, but each side doesn't get a little bit. So you're better off negotiating than you are.
So when you went to your members after negotiating this deal with the Wu administration, and you said to them, this is a good deal, we should take it, what did you highlight?
Actually, the whole deal. So the men and women I represent, they're very happy with the deal. They think it's fair. They think it helps policing evolve into the future, and it helps bring a new light to the services that we provide to the citizens of Boston on a daily basis. It was a landslide victory as far as the vote went, and I think that speaks for itself when it comes to how good the deal is.
A lot of different aspects of it that we'll get into or try to get into here. Yawu, you have written a lot of stories that make the case for reform inside the BPD. Does this contract that Larry says his members see as a slam dunk or a landslide victory, I can't remember which metaphor you used, does it include any reforms that you have identified over the years as especially significant or especially commendable?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the expanded list of crimes that are not subject to arbitration is something that people have been pushing for, although, there are things in there, I mean, certain categories of crime in there that aren't included in that list that are very common. Before
we get into the weeds there, just to be completely clear, I want to describe this in layperson-friendly terms. This is a list of offenses that an officer hypothetically can commit. Back in the day, before this contract, if you committed one of these violations, your discipline would be subject to the arbitration process, and now it is not. Am I summarizing that correctly?
That is correct.
That's correct.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, what are some of the offenses that we're talking about here, Yawu?
Well, for instance, assault and battery to collect a loan is, that you wouldn't go to arbitration for that. You would, if the internal affairs found that to be, found that you had actually committed such a crime, that you would be out of the department. But simple assault and battery, for instance, the most common, I think, assault and battery cases, among the most common, in Boston and in the country, is in a domestic violence situation. That's still subject to arbitration. So if internal affairs deems that you are guilty of such a thing, you can still go to arbitration. And in cases of arbitration, correct me if I'm wrong, Larry, most of the time officers are reinstated. So I mean, there are certain categories of crime, major categories of crime, I think, that are quite common that seem to have been excluded from list of things that would actually get an officer out without a chance of coming back.
It's a great big list of offenses that are no longer subject to arbitration. How was that list shaped? To Yawu's point, for example, why is assault and battery not on there, but assault and battery with intent to collect a loan on there?
So my understanding of the request through the mayor's office when it comes to these charges that you see that are part of the contract are historically cases that officers have been involved in. And what we're trying to do from a union standpoint is put our money where our mouth has been. Look, there's nothing that a police officer dislikes more than a rogue police officer, someone who is involved in criminal acts. No man or woman in uniform wants to work next to a criminal. It's not who we are, it's not who we should be, and it's not what this union wants to represent. So when it came to this list of offenses that the mayor and her team were looking to add into this process, into the collective bargaining agreement, it really was a no-brainer for us.
I was going to ask you, you got ahead of me, which is great. I was going to ask you if it was a tough sell for your members to have these offenses specified that were no longer going to be subject to arbitration, but it sounds like it wasn't.
No, it was not. And if I jump ahead of you, just give me a wink, because I'm new at this. So
that's great, because I always go too slowly, and that way we might not run out of time. What about there's a couple other provisions I want to talk. One involves medical leave. Again, the press release from the city, tell me if I'm getting this right, said that ordinarily about 10% of officers are out on medical leave. That, I believe, is something that has in the past been subject to arbitration, but now it's going to involve an independent medical examiner making the call about whether a particular officer can work or not. Am I getting that right?
You are correct in that, yes.
Okay.
Now it'll be a third opinion that will come forth. The officers have their own primary care physician. The department has a physician as well that follows up, but if those two physicians disagree, then an independent third-party physician will make that call.
Okay, and another important area that I think we should highlight, which we were talking about here before the camera started rolling, is details. Again, I'm going to try to do the, for people like me, the layperson's simple take on it. There's now going to be high priority details that pay higher. Those are going to go, the first crack at those will go to members of your union.
Correct.
Stop me if I'm getting this wrong.
Nope, you're
Then there's
so
going to be lower priority detail work, which is going to go to a wider group of people, including civilians, and there's going to be no more double booking, where, for example, an officer is slated to work 4 hours at a detail, it wraps up after 2 hours, but they're paid for all 4 as they go on to work another detail. Is that a decent synopsis?
Yes, so if I just understood that last part, sorry. In more simplistic terms, I think, because you have a pretty good grasp on the public safety detail system, but essentially for anyone that's listening, watching, you cannot take another job until that clock expires. So if you're doing a 4-hour job, you can't take another job until that 4 hours has expired. Therefore, you're not getting paid for 2 jobs at the same time.
Okay, thank you. Yawu, detail reform is something that I think people have been interested in for a long time. In terms of what's possible, or what was possible when it came to reforming the way details work, how far does this contract go?
It's hard to say. What people wanted was, the department doesn't have enough officers to fill all the details. What people were pushing for last year was for civilians to be hired on as flaggers on these projects, particularly in cases where the department was unable to fill those assignments. What this does is it gives municipal police, university police, other law enforcement access to those jobs. The lowest priority is for people who are not sworn officers to have access to flagger jobs. It falls pretty far short of what people are asking for. I mean, they saw an economic opportunity. These details are lucrative, otherwise people wouldn't be signing up for them. It remains to be seen how many civilians will actually get to serve in that capacity. And I think Boston is kind of an outlier in major cities, requiring that somebody to be a flagger on a construction project is actually a sworn officer.
Is Yawu right about that? Is that unusual?
When you say, is he right about it, I think I lost track of what he was saying.
I was
Are you saying that...
Specifically
Go ahead,
about Boston being an outlier, requiring that on most major construction projects, the flagger is, or the detail worker is a police officer?
It's hard for me to speak about what happens throughout the entire Commonwealth, of course, but my understanding is police officers throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts are required by any town or city municipal ordinance that requires them to be there for public safety. But I can speak, obviously, very intelligent about the Boston Police Department and how the city here works. Right. And it is required for public safety on the roadway for any construction job that's going on per permit and through ordinance of the city of Boston.
I apologize.
I was going to say, I think that sometimes the misconception about what we're doing on the street, because a picture speaks 1,000 words. Obviously, his cell phones are everywhere, and yet you see that police officer who might be talking to the crew about how they're going to move their construction vehicle, sometimes can be deemed as though the officer isn't paying attention to what's going on, or the great picture of the officer sipping a cup of coffee on the 2 seconds he turns his back. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we're there for public safety, and that's the main reason we're there.
Yawu, we have talked before about what might happen with Mayor Wu in the next election cycle. I'm curious about what you think the politics of this contract that she reached with the BPPA are going to be. Is it going to open her up to criticism from people on the left, for example, who are going to say, you didn't push hard enough, you didn't get reforms in this new deal with the BPPA that we wanted you to get? Is that a possibility?
I think, yeah, certainly in the since the George Floyd incident in 2020, there has been a push nationwide for police reform, and in Boston, a lot of people have said they want to see greater investment in crime prevention, and people believe the way to do that is to shrink the police budget and dedicate some of those resources to, strategies like the street workers program, which is proven to, has been proven in the past to reduce crime, to prevent crime. What we've seen in the last 20 years is that the violent crime rate in Boston has gone down by half, but the number of police officers is, still staying steady, about 2,000. Why are we spending so much on our police department? Why is overtime growing when violent crime is down, when crime in all categories is declining, not just in Boston, but nationwide? But, to see the crime rate cut in half and the level of policing and police spending, continuously going up, I think that's what a lot of people were concerned about.
You posed a big question there. I want to give you about 25 seconds to answer it. Yawu says violent crime is down, half what it used to be. Why is the staffing level the same? Why is overtime going up? What's the answer? Yeah,
and as you see me take a quick note, I do that throughout, so I hope that's okay. So first off, the crime level is definitely down in the last 20 years. As you know, I'm going on my 30th year, born and raised in Boston. It's been a tremendous turnaround. However, your facts may be skewed or incorrect for who's ever given them to you. I came on in 1994. At that point in time, we had roughly 2,000 uniformed men and women answering the calls for service. We are down to about 1,550. I've been all over the media for the past few years beating that drum. That's one of the contributing factors to why the overtime rate and the overtime budget in the department continues to skyrocket. We just don't have enough police officers on the street.
That's an argument I know the council president's been making. So
yes.
Sneak one more thing in really fast, then we got to wrap it up.
Please. Actually, that's great. I touched the overtime.
We'll leave it there for now and take a crack at continuing the convo down the road. Larry Calderon, Yawu Miller, thank you both for being here and talking this stuff through.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
That's it for tonight, but do come back next week. Thanks for watching.
Whether it's breaking